I didn't say a word when my son got married, not about the ceremony, not about the way I was seated near the back of the reception hall, and certainly not about the $53 million sitting quietly in my name, untouched, unseen, and completely unknown to everyone in that room. The wedding took place on a warm June afternoon in Napa Valley, the kind of day people describe as perfect without really noticing the details, but I noticed everything. I noticed how the sunlight hit the white roses lining the aisle, how the guests laughed a little too loudly at the champagne bar, and how my daughter-in-law, Olivia, never once looked in my direction unless someone else was watching. I had chosen a soft blue dress, something modest but elegant, the kind my late husband, Edward, used to say made me look like I belonged in a painting. As I sat there, hands folded neatly in my lap, I thought about what he would have said if he could see this moment, his son standing at the altar, smiling, building a new life. He would have been proud. He would have believed, as I once did, that family meant something steady, something unbreakable. But I had learned, quietly and without announcement, that not all bonds hold the way we expect them to. When Daniel walked down the aisle with Olivia, he didn't glance at me. Not once. It was a small thing, something most people wouldn't notice, but I felt it settle in my chest like a weight. During the reception, I found my name on a place card tucked between two distant relatives I barely recognized, positioned near the service doors where waiters passed in and out carrying trays of food. It wasn't an accident. Olivia had planned every detail of that wedding with precision, from the imported flowers to the seating chart, and I understood exactly what my placement meant. I smiled anyway. I nodded politely when spoken to. I thanked the staff when they refilled my water glass. From the outside, I looked like a mother content with her son's happiness. And in a way, I was. But contentment and awareness are not the same thing. Across the room, I watched Olivia greet guests, her laughter bright, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm as if she had always belonged there, as if she had rewritten the story of this family without ever asking permission. There was a moment, brief and almost forgettable, when she leaned in close to one of her friends and whispered something that made them both smile in a way that didn't reach their eyes. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I had seen that expression before. Years of marriage, years of raising a child, years of managing a home and a life, they teach you how to read what isn't being said. I sat there, still and composed, while the music played and the glasses clinked and the speeches began. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he thanked Olivia's parents first, praising their generosity, their support, their guidance. Then he thanked their friends, their community, everyone who had helped make the day possible. My name never came up. Not even once. And still, I didn't react. I didn't interrupt. I didn't remind him of the years I had spent building the foundation he now stood on. Because the truth is, I had already made a decision long before that day arrived. I had decided that silence can be more powerful than confrontation, that observation reveals more than accusation, and that sometimes the greatest mistake people make is assuming they understand what you have, what you know, and what you are willing to do. As the evening carried on and the sun dipped below the hills, casting everything in a golden glow, I sat there with my quiet secret, watching my son begin a life he believed was entirely his own, unaware that the story was far from finished. The morning after the wedding felt quieter than it should have, as if the house itself had noticed the shift and decided not to comment on it, and I moved through my kitchen slowly, measuring out coffee grounds the same way I had for years, 2 careful scoops into the filter, the familiar rhythm grounding me in something that had not changed, not yet. The sunlight came in through the window above the sink, soft and pale, catching the edges of the dishes I had left to dry overnight, and for a moment everything looked almost peaceful, almost untouched by the previous day. I carried my cup to the dining table and sat in the same chair I had occupied for decades, the one Edward always said had the best view of the backyard, though now the yard felt larger than it used to, emptier somehow, like a space that had outgrown its purpose. I thought about the reception again, not the big moments that everyone else would remember, but the smaller ones that lingered in the quiet corners of my mind, the way Olivia had introduced me to one of her friends as Daniel's mother without using my name, The slight pause before she smiled, as if deciding how much of me to reveal, and how little. It was subtle, easy to dismiss if you wanted to believe in good intentions, but I had stopped doing that some time ago. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed on the table, and I glanced down to see a message from Daniel, short and efficient, thanking me for coming and saying they would be leaving for their honeymoon later that afternoon, a week in Italy, Florence, and Lake Como, places I had once dreamed of visiting with Edward before his health began to decline. I read the message twice, then set the phone down without replying, not out of anger, but because there was nothing in it that required an answer. The distance between us had not been created in a single day, and it would not be repaired with a polite sentence sent between flights. I finished my coffee slowly, letting it grow lukewarm in my hands, and allowed myself to remember the last conversation I had with Edward in this very room, the way he had looked at me with a calm certainty that I had not understood at the time, telling me that people reveal themselves not when everything is going well, but when they believe there is something to gain, something to take, something they think you will not notice. At the time, I had nodded, assuming he was speaking in general terms, offering one of those quiet pieces of wisdom he had collected over a lifetime, but now his words settled differently, sharper, more specific, as if they had been meant for this exact moment. Later that afternoon, I drove past the house Daniel and Olivia had recently purchased, a modern place with clean lines and large windows, the kind of home that looks impressive from the outside but does not yet hold any real memories, and I noticed a moving truck parked in the driveway, boxes being carried inside with careful efficiency. I did not stop. I did not need to. From the street, I could see Olivia standing near the front door, directing the movers with a kind of practiced authority, her posture confident, her expression composed, as if she had already stepped fully into a role she intended to keep. Daniel stood a few feet behind her, checking something on his phone, occasionally nodding, occasionally glancing up, but never quite taking control of the moment. I watched for a few seconds longer than necessary, then continued driving, my hand steady on the wheel, my thoughts even steadier. It was not the first time I had seen this dynamic, and it would not be the last. What mattered was not what they were doing in plain sight, but what they assumed I did not see, the quiet calculations, the unspoken expectations, the belief that time would move in one direction only, that circumstances would remain fixed, that the roles they had assigned me would not change. I turned onto the main road and headed home, passing familiar streets and familiar landmarks, each one a reminder of the life I had built piece by piece year after year, without spectacle, without announcement. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had begun to dip slightly, casting longer shadows across the front lawn, and I sat in the car for a moment before getting out, not because I was uncertain, but because I was taking stock, measuring the distance between what had been and what was beginning to unfold. Inside, the house greeted me with its usual stillness, the quiet kind that does not demand attention but simply exists, waiting. I set my keys on the counter, removed my shoes, and walked into the living room where Edward's photograph rested on the mantel, his expression unchanged, steady, as if he already knew how this would play out. I stood there for a moment, meeting his gaze, and allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of amusement, but of understanding. They believed they were stepping into a future they controlled, a life shaped by their own decisions, their own assumptions, but what they did not understand, what they had never asked, was what I had chosen to keep to myself, what I had chosen to protect, and what I would choose to do. When the time came for silence to end. 3 days later, the silence between us became something that could no longer be mistaken for distance or distraction. It became intentional, shaped, almost rehearsed in the way it unfolded. Daniel called that afternoon, his voice carrying a kind of brightness that felt carefully placed, as if he were speaking from a script he had already practiced in his head, and I listened without interrupting as he told me about their plans, the renovations they wanted to make, the upgrades they were considering, the future they were building piece by piece in a house that still smelled like fresh paint and unopened boxes. He spoke about expanding the kitchen, about knocking down a wall to create more space, about adding a guest suite that he described as perfect for visitors, though something in the way he said it made it clear that the word guest did not include me. I responded when necessary, offering small acknowledgments, keeping my tone even, giving him exactly what he expected and nothing more. There was a pause then, a brief moment where his voice softened slightly, and he asked if I had considered selling the house, not as a suggestion, but as a possibility that had already been discussed somewhere else, somewhere I had not been invited to. I looked around the room as he spoke, at the furniture Edward and I had chosen together, at the photographs lining the shelves, at the quiet history embedded in every corner, and I understood that this was not a casual question, it was a test, a way of measuring how much I would be willing to give up, how easily I would step aside. I told him I had not made any decisions, and that I preferred to take my time, choosing each word carefully, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted him to hear the steadiness in my voice, the absence of hesitation. He accepted the answer quickly, too quickly, as if the outcome did not matter as long as the conversation moved forward, and within minutes he shifted to lighter topics, travel plans, restaurant reservations, the view from their hotel in Florence, all of it delivered with a smoothness that suggested he had already compartmentalized everything else. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and sat there for a while, not thinking in the way people expect, but observing the pattern that was beginning to take shape. Later that evening, I received a message from Olivia, the first she had sent since the wedding, a short note thanking me again for attending and mentioning how busy things had been with the move, the honeymoon, the adjustments, each sentence polished, polite, and entirely without warmth. At the end of the message, almost as an afterthought, she added that they would love to have me over once everything was settled, perhaps in a few weeks, when the house felt more like home. I read the message twice, noting the phrasing, the timing, the careful distance it maintained, and I could almost see the structure behind it, the intention to keep me at the edges, close enough to appear included, far enough to remain irrelevant. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard as the evening light began to fade, the sky shifting from pale blue to a deeper shade, the kind of transition that happens quietly, without announcement, but changes everything nonetheless. I thought about the conversation with Daniel, about the message from Olivia, about the way both of them had begun to move in the same direction without ever stating it directly, and I recognized something that felt familiar, not because I had experienced it before in this exact form, but because I understood the principle behind it. It was not about the house. It was not about space or convenience or timing. It was about control, about shaping the narrative before anyone else had the chance to question it, about creating a version of reality where my presence could be reduced, adjusted, eventually removed without conflict. I returned to the table, picked up my phone, and typed a brief response to Olivia, thanking her for the message and saying I would look forward to visiting when the time was right, keeping my words simple, measured, leaving no trace of resistance, no indication that I had seen anything beyond what was written. Then I set the phone down and allowed the silence to settle again, not as something empty, but as something deliberate, something I was beginning to use rather than endure. Because the more they assumed I did not understand, the more clearly everything revealed itself, and the more certain I became that when the moment arrived, I would not need to explain anything at all. It was not a single moment that changed everything, but a series of small realizations that began to connect in ways I could no longer ignore, like pieces of a puzzle that had always been there, waiting for me to see the full picture. I started noticing how often Edward had tried to tell me things without saying them directly, how he would pause in the middle of a sentence, look at me with that steady expression, and choose his words more carefully than usual, as if he understood something I did not yet see. In the early years of our marriage, I thought it was simply his way, his quiet nature, his tendency to think before he spoke, but as I stood in the living room now, surrounded by the life we had built together, I began to understand that those pauses had meaning, that they had been warnings wrapped in gentleness. One evening, not long before his health began to decline, we had sat at this very table, the same one where I now rested my hands, and he had asked me a question that felt ordinary at the time but now echoed differently in my mind. He asked me what I would do if I ever felt alone in a room full of family, and I remember smiling, brushing the question aside, telling him that such a thing would never happen, that family was the one place where loneliness did not belong. He did not argue. He simply nodded, the way he always did when he chose not to correct me, and changed the subject. I see now that he was not asking out of curiosity. He was preparing me. The following week, he had insisted we meet with his attorney, a man named Harrison Cole, someone he had trusted for years, and I recall feeling slightly impatient during that meeting, not because I did not care, but because everything seemed so far away, so theoretical, something for a distant future that did not yet feel real. Edward, however, was precise, attentive to every detail, asking questions about clauses, conditions, and contingencies, making sure that everything was documented exactly as he intended. At one point, he placed his hand gently over mine and said, in that calm, steady voice, that there are moments in life when silence protects you more than explanation, and that if those moments ever came, I should trust my instincts and not feel the need to justify myself to anyone. I remember nodding, not fully understanding, but trusting him enough not to question it. After he passed, I followed the instructions he had left behind, meeting with Harrison again, going over the documents more carefully this time, reading each line with a different kind of attention, one shaped by absence rather than routine. That was when I saw it clearly, the structure he had built, the safeguards he had quietly put in place, not just to preserve what he had earned, but to protect me from situations he must have anticipated. The estate was not simply transferred. It was layered, conditional in ways that required awareness, discretion, and, above all, patience. There were provisions that could be activated under specific circumstances, language that addressed treatment, respect, and intent, terms that went beyond financial distribution and into the realm of character and behavior. At the time, I found it unusual, perhaps even excessive, but now, standing here with the echoes of recent conversations still fresh in my mind, I understood exactly why he had done it. He had seen something I had chosen not to see, or perhaps something that had not yet fully formed but was already taking shape beneath the surface. I walked over to the mantel and picked up his photograph, running my fingers lightly along the frame, not out of longing, but out of recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that his foresight had become my foundation. The house remained still around me, the same walls, the same furniture, the same quiet presence that had held our life together for so many years, but the way I moved through it had changed. I was no longer simply remembering. I was preparing. And the more I revisited those conversations, those carefully chosen words, the more certain I became that nothing unfolding now was entirely unexpected, not to him, and no longer to me. The next time I saw Harrison Cole, it was not out of obligation, but out of clarity, the kind that settles in quietly and then refuses to leave, and I arrived at his office on a calm Tuesday morning, the same building Edward and I had visited years before, though everything about this visit felt different, more deliberate, more grounded in purpose than routine. Harrison greeted me with the same composed professionalism I remembered, his handshake firm, his expression measured, as if he had been expecting this moment even before I scheduled the appointment. We sat across from each other in a conference room that overlooked the city, sunlight filtering through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished table, and for a brief moment, neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because we both understood that what needed to be discussed required precision rather than haste. I placed my handbag beside me and folded my hands in front of me, meeting his gaze without hesitation, and told him that I had begun to notice certain patterns, certain shifts in behavior that made Edward's decisions feel less like preparation and more like protection. Harrison nodded slowly, not surprised, not concerned, simply acknowledging what he had likely anticipated from the beginning. He opened a folder, one I recognized from our previous meetings, and turned it toward me, revealing the documents that had once felt distant and now felt immediate, relevant in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. He walked me through the structure again, not in broad terms, but in careful detail, explaining how the estate was designed to remain entirely under my control, how no transfer, no access, no shared benefit could occur without my explicit and voluntary decision, and how certain clauses had been included to address situations where influence, pressure, or manipulation might be present. His voice remained steady, professional, but there was an undertone of respect in the way he spoke, as if he recognized that I was no longer the same person who had once listened with polite detachment. When he reached the section Edward had emphasized most strongly, he paused, allowing me the space to read the language again, slowly, deliberately, each word carrying weight that I now fully understood. The clause did not rely on emotion. It did not require confrontation. It was simple, clear, and final. Any individual who demonstrated sustained disrespect, coercion, or intent to exploit my position would be permanently excluded from any future consideration, not temporarily, not conditionally, but completely, with no possibility of reversal once enacted. I felt a quiet stillness settle over me as I read it, not shock, not hesitation, but recognition, the kind that comes when something you once overlooked suddenly becomes undeniable. Harrison leaned back slightly, giving me space, and asked if I had any questions. I did not. Instead, I asked him something else, something more direct. I asked him what would happen if I chose to do nothing, if I allowed events to unfold without interference, without revealing what I knew or what I had. He considered the question carefully before answering, explaining that the structure would remain intact, that time alone would not alter the terms, but that inaction would also allow others to continue operating under assumptions that could become more difficult to address later. I nodded, absorbing the implications, understanding that silence was not the same as passivity, that it could be a strategy, but only if it was intentional, measured, and timed correctly. Before I left, Harrison reminded me of something Edward had once said during one of their private discussions, a detail he had not shared with me until now. He told me that Edward had been very clear about one thing, that I should never feel obligated to reward proximity, that being family did not automatically grant access, and that respect, once lost, should not be negotiated back into place. I thanked him, not with words alone, but with a steady look that conveyed more than acknowledgement, and when I stepped out of the building into the afternoon light, I felt something shift within me, not a dramatic change, but a quiet alignment between what I knew and what I was prepared to do. The world around me moved as it always did, cars passing, people walking, conversations blending into the background, but my perspective had narrowed in the most precise way, focusing not on what was visible, but on what was inevitable. Because the more I understood the framework Edward had left behind, the clearer it became that the outcome would not be determined by what they expected, but by what I chose, and for the first time since the wedding, I allowed myself to consider that choice not as a reaction, but as a decision already forming, steady and irreversible. In the weeks that followed, I did exactly what they expected me to do, and nothing more, which was precisely why they never questioned it, because predictability creates comfort, and comfort creates blindness. I accepted their invitation when it finally came. Waiting just long enough to make it seem natural, not eager, not distant, simply appropriate, and when I arrived at their new house on a quiet Sunday afternoon, I carried with me a small box of pastries from a local bakery Daniel used to love as a child. Something familiar, something harmless. Olivia opened the door with a smile that appeared practiced, her tone warm but measured, as if she had already decided how this interaction would unfold before I even stepped inside. The house was exactly as I had seen it from the street, clean lines, carefully arranged furniture, every detail chosen to reflect a certain image rather than a lived-in reality, and I moved through it slowly, observing without commenting, allowing them to guide the conversation wherever they preferred. Daniel showed me the kitchen first, explaining the renovations they were planning, the upgrades they had already scheduled, speaking with a kind of quiet pride that I recognized from years ago, though now it was layered with something else, something less certain beneath the surface. Olivia added details where necessary, her voice smooth, her presence constant, filling in gaps, redirecting focus, shaping the narrative in subtle ways that might have gone unnoticed by someone less attentive. I listened, nodding occasionally, asking small questions that revealed nothing of my own thoughts, and in doing so, I gave them exactly what they needed, the sense that I remained unchanged, that I had accepted my place in their version of things. We sat down in the living room after a while, the conversation shifting naturally, or what appeared to be naturally, toward future plans, long-term ideas, the kind of discussions that seem casual but are anything but. Olivia mentioned the importance of financial stability, of making smart decisions early, of building something sustainable, and though she never asked directly, the implication was clear, woven carefully into her words. left there for me to acknowledge without forcing the issue. Daniel glanced at me once or twice during this exchange, not with expectation, but with a kind of quiet anticipation, as if waiting to see whether I would offer something, anything, that might align with the direction they were moving. I did not. Instead, I reached for my cup of tea, took a small sip, and allowed a brief silence to settle, not uncomfortable, not tense, simply present, and in that silence, I could feel the shift, subtle but unmistakable, the moment where their assumptions met the reality of my restraint. Olivia recovered first, smiling lightly, redirecting the conversation to safer ground, travel, work, upcoming events, all the usual topics that require no depth and reveal no intent. I followed along easily, matching her tone, her pace, her carefully maintained balance between warmth and distance, and by the time the afternoon came to an end, everything appeared exactly as it should have, at least from the outside. When I stood to leave, Daniel walked me to the door, his expression thoughtful, as if he were trying to place something he could not quite define, and he thanked me for coming, his voice softer than before, though still guarded in a way that suggested he was holding something back. I told him I was glad to see them settled, choosing my words with the same care I had used all day, and as I stepped outside into the fading light, I felt no urgency, no need to revisit anything that had been said or left unsaid. Because what mattered was not what they had asked, but what they had assumed, and what they had assumed was that I would eventually meet them where they were, that time would soften my boundaries, that familiarity would open doors they had not yet found. But the truth was much simpler than that. I had already decided where I stood, and more importantly, where I did not, and the longer I allowed them to believe otherwise, the clearer everything became, not just to me, but eventually, inevitably, to them as well. It did not take long for the pattern to become more defined, because once people believe they are unobserved, they stop refining their behavior, and what remains is far more revealing than anything carefully presented. Over the next 2 weeks, the calls became slightly more frequent, though never spontaneous, always placed at times that felt deliberate, early evening, just after dinner, when conversations tend to feel more relaxed and less guarded. Daniel would begin with ordinary updates, work, schedules, small inconveniences, easing into a rhythm that suggested familiarity, but beneath it there was always a shift, a subtle turn toward topics that circled around stability, planning, long-term decisions. He never asked directly, not at first, but he began to reference things in ways that assumed future involvement, mentioning how helpful it would be to have family support, how important it was to make smart choices while opportunities were still open. Olivia's presence was quieter during these calls, but not absent. I could hear her in the background occasionally, a comment here, a suggestion there, her voice low but intentional, feeding into the direction of the conversation without taking ownership of it. I listened carefully each time, not interrupting, not correcting, allowing the structure of their thinking to reveal itself piece by piece. One evening, however, the tone shifted more clearly than before. Daniel spoke about the house again, this time more specifically, mentioning that the property values in my area had increased significantly, that it might be a good time to consider selling, not as a necessity, but as an opportunity, a way to reposition assets, as he phrased it, his language sounding less like his own and more like something he had been guided to say. I asked him, calmly, what he meant by repositioning, and there was a brief pause on the line, just long enough to confirm that he had not expected the question. He recovered quickly, explaining that if I chose to downsize, there would be ways to invest the proceeds more efficiently, ways that could benefit everyone in the long run. The word everyone lingered in the air, undefined but unmistakable. I acknowledged his point without agreeing, letting the conversation move forward, but the clarity of that moment stayed with me long after the call ended. The following day, I received an email from Olivia, longer than her previous message, structured, detailed, outlining ideas about financial planning, property management, even suggesting that they could help oversee certain decisions to reduce my burden, as she described it. The tone was polite, almost helpful, but the intention beneath it was no longer subtle. It was organized, purposeful, and increasingly confident. I read the email slowly, noting not just what was written, but how it was presented, the assumptions embedded within each suggestion, the quiet expectation that I would eventually accept their involvement as both natural and necessary. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I printed the email and placed it on the desk in my study, beside a small notebook I had begun to use more frequently, not out of suspicion, but out of discipline, recording dates, conversations, phrasing, not to confront, but to understand the progression, the consistency, the direction. Over the next few days, I added to it, small entries, nothing dramatic, just observations with patterns, the gradual shift from suggestion to expectation, from distance to approach. And with each entry, the structure became clearer, not just in their actions, but in my response to them. Because while they were building a narrative that moved toward inclusion on their terms, I was building something else entirely, something quieter, more precise, something that did not rely on persuasion or agreement. I continued to answer their calls, to respond when appropriate, to maintain the same steady presence they had come to expect, giving no indication that anything had changed. But internally, everything had. The more they spoke, the more they revealed, and the more they revealed, the less I needed to ask. By the end of the second week, I no longer wondered what they intended. I understood it fully. And more importantly, I understood exactly how much further I was willing to let them go before I chose to respond. The shift, when it came, was not loud or sudden, but it carried a finality that left no room for misunderstanding, and it arrived in the form of an invitation that Daniel framed as simple, casual, almost overdue. He suggested we meet for dinner, just the three of us, at their house, saying it had been too long since we sat down properly as a family, his tone light, but with an undercurrent that felt rehearsed, as though the evening had already been outlined before I agreed to attend. I accepted without hesitation, choosing a day that suited them, not because I was accommodating, but because I wanted the setting to remain entirely within their control, exactly as they preferred. When I arrived that evening, the house was quieter than before, more settled, the boxes gone, the spaces filled, everything arranged with intention, as if they were presenting a finished version of something that had been carefully constructed over time. Olivia greeted me at the door with the same composed warmth, her smile steady, her voice measured, and Daniel followed closely behind, his expression attentive in a way that suggested anticipation rather than ease. Dinner was already prepared, the table set with more care than necessary for a simple meal, each detail placed just slightly above what the occasion required, and I recognized it immediately for what it was, not hospitality, but preparation. We sat down together, and for the first few minutes, the conversation followed familiar patterns, work, travel, small observations that required no depth, but beneath it, there was a tension, subtle but present, waiting for the moment when it would surface. It did not take long. Olivia introduced the topic first, her tone gentle, almost hesitant, as if she were approaching something delicate, and she spoke about the importance of planning for the future, about making decisions that would ensure stability and efficiency, her words flowing smoothly, each one placed with care. Daniel picked up where she left off, his voice steady, expanding on the idea, suggesting that they had been thinking about ways to support me, to help manage things that might become overwhelming, presenting it not as a need, but as an offer, something generous, something thoughtful. I listened without interruption, allowing them to complete their explanation fully, not rushing, not reacting, giving them the space to say everything they intended to say. When they finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that follows a carefully delivered message, and I could see it in their expressions, the expectation, quiet but clear, that I would respond in a way that aligned with the direction they had set. Instead, I reached for my glass of water, took a small sip, and set it back down with the same steady motion I had used all evening. Then I looked at them, not with surprise, not with confusion, but with a calm that did not shift, and I spoke in a voice that matched the stillness of the room. I told them that I understood their concerns, that I appreciated the thought behind their suggestions, and that I had already taken steps to ensure that everything was being managed exactly as it should be. Daniel blinked, just once, a small reaction that might have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching closely, and Olivia's smile held for a moment longer than necessary before settling into something more neutral. I did not elaborate. I did not explain what those steps were or who was involved. I allowed the statement to stand on its own, complete and sufficient. The conversation shifted after that, not abruptly, but with a subtle change in tone, the earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more measured. They asked a few follow-up questions, carefully phrased, attempting to gather more information without appearing direct, but I answered each one with the same consistency, acknowledging without revealing, responding without opening anything further. By the time dinner ended, the structure of the evening had changed entirely, not in what was said, but in what was no longer assumed. When I stood to leave, Daniel walked me to the door again, his expression thoughtful, but this time there was something else beneath it, something closer to uncertainty, and Olivia remained a step behind, her posture composed, but her attention sharper than before. I thanked them for the meal, for the evening, my tone unchanged, my presence as steady as it had been from the moment I arrived, and as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I did not look back. Because the moment had passed, and with it, the version of the future they had been quietly building without me, replaced now by something they did not yet understand, but would soon enough. The next morning, I did not rush, because there was nothing left that required urgency, and I moved through my routine with the same quiet precision that had carried me through the past weeks, preparing coffee, opening the windows, letting the early light settle into the rooms that had held my life for so many years. The air felt different, not because anything had changed around me, but because something had settled within me, a decision that no longer needed to be considered, only carried out. By mid-morning, I was seated once again in Harrison Cole's office, the same polished table, the same filtered sunlight, but this time there was no hesitation, no need for clarification, only confirmation. He placed the documents in front of me, each page marked, each section prepared, and I read them carefully, not because I doubted their content, but because I respected the finality of what they represented. The language was clear, structured exactly as Edward had intended, and as I moved through each line, I could feel the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a certainty. Harrison did not rush me. He understood that this was not a moment for persuasion or explanation, only for decision. When I finished, I set the pen down briefly, looking at the signature line that would formalize everything that had been quietly building beneath the surface, and for a moment, I allowed myself to reflect, not on what I was losing, but on what I had already understood. Then I picked up the pen again and signed my name, steady, deliberate, without pause. The effect was immediate, though not visible, a shift that existed entirely within the structure Edward had created, activating conditions that required no announcement, no confrontation, only recognition. When I left the office, the city moved as it always did, unchanged, unaware, and I returned home with the same calm that had carried me through every step of this process. I did not call Daniel. I did not send a message. I allowed the information to reach him the way it was designed to, formally, directly, without interpretation. It happened later that afternoon. My phone rang once, then again, Daniel's name appearing on the screen with a frequency that had not existed before, and when I answered, his voice was different, no longer measured, no longer controlled, but unsettled in a way that confirmed everything I had already known. He asked questions quickly, too quickly, trying to piece together something he had not anticipated, and I listened without interrupting, allowing him to say everything he needed to say before I responded. When I spoke, my tone did not change. I told him that everything had been handled according to the terms that had always existed, that nothing had been taken, nothing had been altered beyond what was already in place, and that the outcome reflected decisions that had been made over time, not in a single moment. There was a silence then, longer than any we had shared before, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something unfamiliar, not anger, not even disappointment, but realization. Olivia's voice appeared in the background briefly, sharper, more urgent, but I did not respond to it. I did not need to. I had already said what was necessary. After the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and sat quietly for a moment, not in reflection, not in regret, but in acknowledgement of what had just been completed. The house remained still around me, unchanged, the same walls, the same light, the same quiet presence that had always been there, and I stood, walking slowly to the window, looking out at the yard that Edward and I had tended together for years. The trees moved slightly in the breeze, steady, grounded, unaffected by anything beyond their own place in the world, and I allowed myself a small, quiet breath, not of relief, but of clarity. Because in the end, nothing had been taken from me. Nothing had been lost. What had changed was simply the illusion, the version of things that others had believed would continue without question, without consequence. And as I turned away from the window and moved back into the house, I did not feel the need to explain anything further, not to them, not to anyone. The silence I had chosen had done exactly what it was meant to do, and now, it was no longer silence at all, but something far more permanent.